The crash landing. The world was spinning. Or maybe it was just his head. Ethan groaned as he slowly opened his eyes. His body ached all over. A sharp pain stabbed his ribs as he shifted slightly. The air smelled strange, thick, humid, and heavy with something unfamiliar. He blinked several times, trying to focus. Where was he? His memory rushed back like a crashing wave. The ambush. The pirates. The escape pod malfunctioning. He had ejected from his ship during a space battle. But after that, everything went black. Now he was here. But where was here? Ethan struggled to sit up, his hand brushing against the cold metal of the broken escape pod. Smoke curled from the wreckage, rising into a sky that wasn't like any he had seen before. The sun, or suns, he realized, burned a deep orange, casting long shadows across the landscape. Towering trees with blue leaves and thick twisted trunks stretched high above him. The air was too thick. The gravity was heavy. This wasn't Earth. This wasn't any known colony either. His suit's wrist display flickered weakly. The screen cracked. He tapped it. Nothing. No signal. No connection. He was completely alone. A deep growl rumbled from the trees. Ethan froze. His pulse pounded in his ears. His eyes darted toward the shadows between the trees. Something was watching him. Another growl, closer this time. The sound was deep, guttural, something too big to be safe. Ethan moved quickly. His leg hurt, but he forced himself to stand. He reached inside the escape pod, searching desperately for anything useful. His emergency kit was gone, lost during a crash. His weapons? Gone too. A low rustling noise came from behind him. Ethan spun around. His breath caught in his throat. Massive figures emerged from the jungle. They were tall, at least 10 feet high. Their bodies were covered in tribal armor, made of bones, leather, and strange glowing stones. Their skin shimmered with patterns of war paint, and their eyes burned with intensity. Not animals, not pirates, something else. They carried long spears, the tips glowing faintly, as if charged with energy. Their movements were slow, calculated. Hunters, warriors. Ethan raised his hands, stepping back slowly. He didn't want to start a fight he had no chance of winning. The tallest one, a woman with long braided hair and piercing yellow eyes, stepped forward. She studied him, her gaze sharp and unreadable. She said something in a deep, commanding voice. Ethan didn't understand a word. He shook his head, taking another step back. Her eyes narrowed. The next moment, she moved. Fast. Before he could react, she grabbed him by the arm, her grip like iron. Ethan struggled, but it was useless. Her strength was inhuman. Another warrior approached, pointing at the wreckage of the escape pod. They spoke in their strange, unfamiliar language, glancing at Ethan as they gestured toward the sky. They knew he wasn't from here. The leader said something again, this time sharper. A command. Ethan clenched his jaw. He didn't have a choice. If he fought, he'd lose. If he ran, he wouldn't get far. So, for now, he let them take him. They dragged him through the jungle, their long strides forcing him to keep up. The ground trembled slightly beneath their steps. These women weren't just big, they were powerful. As they walked, Ethan noticed something strange. The jungle was too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. That wasn't a good sign. The warriors brought him to a towering cliffside village, where massive stone structures were built into the rock. Fires burned in large pits, and dozens of warriors stood watching as Ethan was led through. Their stares were unreadable, some curious, others cautious. They brought him to the center of the village, where an ancient-looking stone throne sat. Another woman waited there, older, but just as powerful. Her gaze was sharp, her battle-scarred face unreadable. The leader who captured him spoke rapidly, gesturing at Ethan, at the sky, at the broken escape pod. The older woman listened, then stood. She walked toward Ethan, studying him closely. Then she spoke a single word. A question. Ethan had no idea what she had asked, but the entire village waited for his answer. His throat felt dry. His mind raced. How could he answer when he didn't even understand? He took a deep breath and did the only thing he could think of. He raised his hand slowly and pointed to himself. "Ethan," he said. "My name is Ethan." Silence. Then, to his surprise, the older woman nodded. She turned to the others and spoke a single command. The warriors released their grip on him. The tension in the air shifted. Ethan exhaled, feeling slightly less like a prisoner. But he wasn't free. Not yet. The leader looked at him again, her golden eyes narrowing. Then she said something to the others. The warriors around him grinned. Some even laughed. Ethan didn't understand the words, but the message was clear. He had just been given a challenge. And if he failed, he wouldn't be leaving this village alive. The Amazonian judgment. Ethan stood in the center of the alien village, surrounded by towering warriors. Their golden eyes glowed in the dim firelight, their expressions unreadable. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with silent judgment. A few held their weapons tightly, as if expecting him to make a sudden move. The old warrior queen, the one who had studied him so closely, stepped forward. Her battle-scarred face was calm, but her eyes held the weight of authority. She spoke in her deep, commanding voice. Ethan had no idea what she was saying. The leader who had captured him, the tall Amazon with the braided hair and fierce gaze, stepped closer. She nodded at the queen, then turned to Ethan. She pointed at the jungle, then at him. Then she drew her finger across her throat. Ethan swallowed hard. That was universal. The meaning was clear. He had to prove himself, or die. The trial begins. The warriors moved quickly, wasting no time. A group of them grabbed Ethan's arms, dragging him across the village. He didn't fight back. He had already decided that struggling would be useless. He needed to learn. He needed to understand. They stopped near the edge of the jungle, where the trees grew thicker and darker. A massive bonfire crackled behind them, casting long shadows over the clearing. The air smelled of something smoky and metallic, something Ethan couldn't quite place. The braided warrior, the one who had captured him, tossed something at his feet. Ethan looked down. A knife. It wasn't like anything he had seen before. The blade was made of some kind of dark metal, reflecting a faint red glow. The handle was wrapped in thick leather, but the craftsmanship was crude. This was a weapon made for survival, not beauty. She pointed to the knife, then pointed to the jungle. Ethan frowned. They wanted him to go in there, alone. The warrior queen spoke again, and this time, another warrior stepped forward, holding something in her hands. A small leather pouch. She tossed it to Ethan, and he barely caught it. He opened it carefully. Inside, he found a handful of dried meat, a small flask of water, and a single smooth stone with strange markings etched into it. Ethan held up the stone, confused. "What is this?" he muttered. The warriors didn't answer. They just watched. Then, with one final command from the queen, the braided warrior stepped forward, grabbing Ethan by the shoulder. She leaned in close, her golden eyes staring into his. Then she whispered something. A single word. He didn't understand the language, but he understood the weight of it. She stepped back, and before Ethan could ask anything, two warriors grabbed him and pushed him toward the jungle. The moment he crossed into the darkness, he heard the sound of their war horns. The trial had begun. The jungle of death. The moment Ethan stepped into the jungle, he felt the change. The air grew thick, damp, heavy with an unnatural silence. The trees loomed over him like ancient giants, their twisted branches curling like claws against the sky. Thick vines covered the ground, and strange glowing plants pulsed with eerie green light. Ethan tightened his grip on the knife, This place wasn't just dangerous. It was alive. Somewhere in the distance, something howled. Ethan's pulse quickened. He needed to move. He pushed forward, moving carefully. His boots sank slightly into the damp earth. Every step felt like it echoed in the unnatural silence. What was he even supposed to do? Survive the night? Hunt something? Find something? He had no answers. Then the ground shifted beneath his feet. Ethan barely had time to react before a massive clawed hand shot out from the dirt. The hunter becomes the hunted. Instinct took over. Ethan jumped back just in time to avoid the claws that tried to wrap around his leg. The ground exploded, and from beneath the earth, a monstrous serpent-like beast emerged. Its body was covered in thick, black scales, and its head was a nightmarish fusion of a snake and a wolf, long fangs, red glowing eyes, and a forked tongue that flicked in the air. It was hunting him. Ethan had no time to think. The creature lunged, and he rolled to the side, the beast's massive jaws snapping just inches from his face. Adrenaline pumped through his veins. He needed a plan. He remembered the knife, his only weapon. But how do you kill something this big with just a knife? The answer came faster than he expected. As the creature lunged again, Ethan noticed something: the soft, glowing spots beneath its throat. A weak point. He didn't hesitate. As the beast charged, Ethan dodged at the last second, then thrust the knife upward with all his strength. The blade sank deep into the glowing spot. The creature screamed. It thrashed violently, knocking Ethan back, but the damage was done. Thick, black liquid poured from its wound. It staggered, its body convulsing before it collapsed to the ground. Ethan gasped for air, his hands shaking. He did it. Then, a sound behind him made him freeze. He turned slowly. The braided warrior was standing at the edge of the jungle, watching him. She had been there the whole time. Her golden eyes gleamed with something strange: approval. She stepped forward, looking down at the dying beast. Then, without a word, she pulled a bone dagger from her belt and plunged it into the creature's skull, ending its suffering. Then she turned to Ethan. She said something, her voice calm, but firm. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out her hand. Ethan hesitated. Was this acceptance, acknowledgement? He slowly took her hand. And as she pulled him back toward the village, he realized something. He had passed the first test. But this was only the beginning. The deadly jungle trial. The village fire still burned behind Ethan as he was led away, deeper into the alien wilderness. His hands were still sore from gripping the knife, and his heartbeat hadn't slowed since the encounter with the serpent beast. He had survived the first trial, but something told him this was far from over. The braided warrior, the one who had captured him, walked ahead, leading him without a word. Her golden eyes had lost some of their earlier hostility, but she remained unreadable. They walked for what felt like hours, the jungle growing darker, the air heavier with an eerie silence. Strange, glowing vines pulsed against the trees, casting unnatural green light over the ground. Every step felt like walking through a breathing, living thing. Finally, they stopped. The warrior turned and pointed ahead. Ethan followed her gaze. A cave entrance loomed before them, its mouth wide and jagged, as if something had chewed into the earth itself. Black mist seeped from within, swirling unnaturally around the entrance. Ethan's stomach dropped. He already knew what this meant. The real test begins. The braided warrior unsheathed her bone dagger, its surface carved with glowing symbols. She held it up, then drove it into the ground between them. A statement, a challenge. She spoke a single word, a command. Ethan didn't need a translator to understand. Go inside. Survive. Come back. She stepped back, folding her arms, waiting. Ethan took a deep breath. His body still ached, his muscles sore from the fight with the serpent, but this was no time to show weakness. He picked up the knife and turned toward the cave. The moment he stepped inside, the air changed. The cave of the forgotten. The jungle was humid, but the cave, cold, bitter cold. The walls were slick, pulsing like they were alive. Ethan's breath came out in a visible mist, even though the heat from outside should have followed him in. A strange whispering filled the air. Not words, not voices. Something older, something watching. Ethan tightened his grip on the knife and stepped forward. His boots crunched against bones. He froze. The ground beneath him was littered with skeletal remains. Some human-sized, some far larger. Whatever had been brought here before him hadn't left. A sudden screech echoed from the depths of the cave. Ethan turned sharply, knife raised, heart pounding. Something moved in the darkness. Something big. Then the shadows came alive. The monster in the dark. A pair of red, glowing eyes opened, staring directly at him. The whispering turned into a low, guttural growl. Ethan took a slow step back. The thing moved. Fast. It slammed into the cavern wall, knocking loose jagged pieces of rock. Ethan barely rolled out of the way as clawed hands the size of his torso smashed into the ground where he had just stood. It was huge. Its body was cloaked in shifting, black mist, but Ethan could make out long, twisted limbs and massive claws. Its face was featureless, just a mouth of jagged, shifting teeth. This was no animal. This was something ancient, something waiting. And now it had found him. The desperate fight. The beast lunged, and Ethan barely had time to react. He jumped back, rolling over bones, and slashed wildly with his knife. The blade hit something solid. The creature screeched and recoiled, black mist curling from the wound like smoke. It could be hurt. Ethan didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, slamming the knife toward its chest. But the creature was too fast. A clawed hand caught him mid-strike and threw him across the cave. He hit the wall hard, gasping as pain exploded across his ribs. He barely had time to recover before the beast charged again. Too fast, too strong, too deadly. He needed to outthink it. Ethan's eyes darted around the cave. There had to be something he could use. Then he saw it. The walls, the mist, the strange pulse in the rock. The cave itself was alive, turning the cave against itself. Ethan scrambled to his feet, backing toward the farthest wall. He needed to test his theory. The beast snarled, then charged. At the last second, Ethan ducked low and rolled away. The creature slammed full force into the cave wall, and the wall reacted. A tremor rippled through the stone, and suddenly, jagged spines of rock shot downward from the ceiling. The creature howled as one of the spines pierced its shoulder, pinning it in place. Ethan didn't wait. He grabbed a jagged bone from the ground, ran forward, and drove it into the creature's exposed chest. A horrific screech filled the cave. The beast thrashed, its black mist curling violently, its body beginning to collapse inward. Then it vanished. Not dead, just gone. The whispers in the air stopped. The cave was silent once more. The return to the Amazons. Ethan stood there for a long moment, breathing hard. He had done it. He had survived. But he had the sinking feeling that whatever that thing was, it had let him go. Shaking the thought from his mind, he turned and walked out of the cave. The braided warrior was waiting. Her expression didn't change, but her golden eyes held something new. Respect. She gestured toward the village. He had passed their test. Ethan exhaled. He was still alive. But deep down, he knew this was far from over. Whatever that thing in the cave had been, it was still out there. And somehow, he knew, it wouldn't be the last time they met. The lost technology and the truth. Ethan barely felt his legs as he walked back toward the Amazonian village. His entire body ached. His ribs screamed with every breath. His hands were still slick with sweat, and his mind reeled from what he had just survived. That creature, that thing, what was it? The cave had been more than just a test. It had been a warning. Something ancient lurked beneath this planet, something no one had spoken of yet. The braided warrior, his captor turned judge, walked beside him in silence. The tension between them had shifted. She no longer looked at him like prey. Now she studied him like an equal. The village was waiting when they arrived. The warriors stood in a circle, watching. A fire blazed at the center, its flames casting flickering shadows over the massive stone structures carved into the cliffs. The warrior queen stepped forward, her battle-scarred face unreadable. The braided warrior spoke briefly, her voice calm, her eyes never leaving Ethan. Then silence. The queen finally turned to Ethan. Her golden eyes studied him, searching for something. Then, without a word, she nodded. A low murmur ran through the gathered warriors. Some nodded in approval. Others looked skeptical. A few still wanted him dead. But Ethan wasn't an outsider anymore. He had survived. For now. The first clue. That night, as the warriors celebrated around the fire, Ethan sat near the edge of the village, lost in thought. He hadn't even begun to process what had happened. That thing in the cave. It hadn't just been a mindless predator. It had let him go. And something about the cave itself, the pulsing walls, the unnatural mist, it had felt mechanical. Like technology. He was still thinking about it when the braided warrior sat beside him. She didn't speak right away, just watched the fire, silent as the night. Then, finally, she reached into a leather pouch and pulled out something small, placing it in his hands. Ethan frowned and held it up to the firelight. His breath caught in his throat. It was a metal fragment, small, smooth, and unmistakably human-made. The jungle's hidden secret. Ethan turned to her sharply. "Where did you get this?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stood and motioned for him to follow. They moved away from the village, deeper into the jungle. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and strange flowers that pulsed faintly with bioluminescence. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. Then, Ethan saw it, a crashed structure, half buried beneath tangled vines and thick tree roots. Metal plating, rusted and ancient, poked out from the earth like shattered bones. Symbols were etched across the surface. Not alien markings, but human letters. Ethan's heart pounded as he reached out, brushing dirt away from the metal. The words were faded but still visible. UEF Expeditionary Vessel. Starfall. He took a shaky breath. United Earth Federation. Humans had been here before. The ghosts of the past. Ethan turned to the braided warrior. "This is from my people. How long has this been here?" She didn't answer in words. Instead, she reached down and grabbed a handful of loose soil. Then, slowly, she let it drift through her fingers. A long time. Ethan swallowed hard. If the UEF had sent a mission here before, why hadn't anyone heard about it? What happened to them? He stepped closer, running his fingers along the metal hull. There had to be something. A log, a data core, anything that could explain what had happened. Then he saw it. A jagged opening in the wreckage, just large enough to squeeze through. Ethan turned back to the warrior. "I need to go inside." She hesitated for a long moment, then finally nodded. Inside the forgotten ship. The inside of the wreckage was a tomb. The moment Ethan stepped through the jagged opening, a wave of dust and stale air hit him. The walls were coated in moss and alien growth, but the structure was still intact. He moved carefully, brushing away vines as he stepped through what must have once been a corridor. Then he saw them. Skeletons. Dozens of human skeletons, their bodies still clad in the remains of old Federation uniforms. Some had helmets still intact, their visors cracked. Others lay clutching rusted weapons. Ethan's stomach twisted. Whatever had happened here, they had fought to the last man. His hand shook as he knelt beside one of the bodies. The skull was partially buried in dirt, but something metallic gleamed beneath it. A data pad. He wiped the dust away, praying it still worked. A flicker. A weak hum. It powered on. The warning. The screen flickered weakly, glitching as it struggled to function after decades, maybe centuries, of decay. Ethan tapped it carefully, scrolling through old files. Most were corrupted, but one remained intact. A video log. He pressed play. Static. Then, a man's face appeared, ghostly and hollow, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. His uniform was torn, his hair a mess. He spoke quickly, his voice shaky. "This is Commander Rayner of the UEF Starfall. This message is a warning. We were wrong. We shouldn't have come here." A low growl rumbled through the recording. The man flinched. He looked over his shoulder, terror flashing across his face. "They're waking up. They've always been here, buried beneath the planet, waiting. We thought they were just ruins. We thought." A horrific screech filled the audio, and the screen glitched violently. Ethan's blood turned to ice. The recording cut to black. The truth buried below. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the dark screen. His mind raced. The UEF had sent an expedition here. They had found something. Something ancient. Something buried. And it had wiped them out. He turned back to the braided warrior. She had watched the recording over his shoulder, her face unreadable. But Ethan saw something in her eyes. She already knew. She already knew something was buried beneath this planet. She just hadn't told him. Ethan exhaled slowly. The test. The cave. The creature in the darkness. It hadn't been just a trial. It had been a glimpse of what was coming. And now, Ethan was sure of one thing. The past wasn't done with this planet, and neither were the things that had been left behind. The awakening of the ancient horror. The jungle was different now. Quieter. Heavier. As if the very air knew what Ethan had just discovered. He and the braided warrior stood in silence near the ruined starfall, the flickering data pad screen still gripped in his hands. Commander Rayner's final warning played over and over in his mind. They're waking up. They've always been here, buried beneath the planet, waiting. Ethan exhaled, trying to steady his thoughts. He turned to the warrior. Her golden eyes held something that hadn't been there before. Fear. She had known something was buried beneath this world. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to understand the dangers of what lay below. Ethan clenched his jaw. How long did they have before whatever had killed the Starfall crew came for them too? A distant rumble shook the ground beneath his feet. Ethan froze. The warrior's head snapped up. She heard it too. Then, another rumble. Louder. Closer. The jungle shuddered. Birds shrieked and took off in every direction. Trees groaned as roots were torn from the ground. Then, from far beyond the village, a deep metallic screech split the air. Ethan's blood ran cold. They were waking up. The first attack. The village was already in chaos when they returned. The warriors stood at the ready, gripping their weapons, staring toward the jungle with tense expressions. The ground trembled again, sending cracks through the stone beneath their feet. The warrior queen stood on the high ground, her golden gaze locked onto the horizon. When she saw Ethan and the braided warrior, she didn't ask for explanations. She didn't need them. She already knew. Ethan jogged up to her, still clutching the datapad. "We have a problem," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping his tone made it clear. The braided warrior spoke quickly in their language, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of something he hadn't seen in the queen before. Doubt. Uncertainty. Whatever was happening, this wasn't part of their legend. A sudden explosion of movement came from the jungle's edge. Then they appeared. The metal beasts. At first, Ethan thought they were just shadows moving through the trees. Then, as they stepped into the firelight, he saw them for what they really were. Tall, skeletal machines, their bodies covered in rusted armor and jagged spines of metal. Their heads were featureless, save for a single burning red eye in the center of their skulls. They moved with unnatural grace, their limbs clicking and shifting, their spiked claws digging into the earth. They weren't just waking up. They were hunting. The warriors didn't hesitate. The first arrows flew. Spears followed. But when they struck the machines, the weapons shattered on impact. Ethan's stomach turned. They weren't prepared for this. A machine let out a high-pitched screech, then lunged forward. The battle had begun. The fight for survival. Ethan dove to the ground as the first machine slammed its claws into the warrior beside him, lifting her into the air like a ragdoll. She struggled, snarled, then the machine's claws pierced straight through her armor. Ethan barely had time to react before another lunged at him. He rolled away just in time as its claws sliced through the dirt where he had been standing. The warrior queen roared a command, and the Amazons fell into position, their massive size and strength allowing them to meet the machines head-on. But strength wasn't enough. One warrior swung her axe into the machine's neck, only for the blade to snap like glass. Another warrior hurled her spear, but it bounced harmlessly off the metallic beast's chest. They weren't fighting animals. They were fighting machines built for war. And they were losing. Ethan's gamble. Ethan's mind raced. They needed a weakness. Then he remembered the Starfall wreckage. The technology. The human weapons. If they could get to the ship, if it still had working weapons, maybe they had a chance. Ethan turned to the braided warrior, grabbing her arm. "We need to go back to the ship." She frowned, not understanding. He pointed toward the jungle, then mimicked firing a gun. A weapon. Her eyes widened with realization. For a split second, she hesitated. She looked toward the battle, at her people fighting and dying against an enemy they didn't understand. Then she nodded. They ran. A desperate plan. The jungle blurred around them as they sprinted back toward the wreckage. The ground shook violently now, something deeper beneath the planet shifting. The machines weren't the only thing waking up. By the time they reached the ship, Ethan was gasping for breath. He dove inside, ripping open old storage crates. His hands flew over the rusted metal until he found what he was looking for. An old UEF rifle. He grabbed it, checking the energy cell. Low charge. Maybe 3 shots. Not enough. Ethan turned, his mind racing. They needed explosives. His eyes landed on a crate marked thermal charges. He grinned. That would do. He turned to the warrior. "We're blowing them to hell." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the look in his eyes. She grinned back. The counterattack. By the time they returned to the village, the battle was a massacre. Half the warriors lay dead. The others were holding their ground, but just barely. The queen fought at the center, her blade broken, her arm bleeding. The machines were winning. Ethan didn't wait. He dropped to one knee, aimed the rifle at the nearest machine, and fired. The blue energy blast struck the machine's head. For a second, nothing happened. Then, bang. The entire thing collapsed in a heap of sparking metal. The warriors stared in shock. Ethan stood, gripping the rifle tight. "Yeah, that's right. You're not invincible." Then he turned to the warrior. He pulled the thermal charge from his belt and pointed at the ground. They needed a trap. She grinned, then roared a battle cry. The warriors moved as one, retreating toward Ethan as he and the braided warrior set the explosives. As the machines charged, the queen gave the command. The warriors leaped away. Ethan slammed the detonator. A massive explosion ripped through the battlefield. The machines vanished in a wave of fire and smoke. When the dust settled, the few that remained staggered, broken. The warriors finished the rest. The aftermath. The village stood in silence. The Amazon stared at Ethan, not with distrust, but with something new. Respect. The queen finally stepped forward. She studied Ethan long and hard. Then she bowed her head. Ethan exhaled. They had won. But deep down, he knew. This was just the beginning. The real war was still coming. The battle for survival. The fires still burned. The scent of charred metal and blood filled the air, mixing with the thick jungle mist. The village, once a place of power and tradition, now stood in ruin. Ethan stood amidst the wreckage, his hand still gripping the UEF rifle. Smoke curled from its barrel, the last shot fired. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline still surging through his veins. They had won. But only for now. The warrior queen stood before him, her golden eyes scanning the battlefield. The braided warrior stood beside her, breathing heavily, her armor dented, her blade stained with the black fluid of the fallen machines. The survivors gathered, forming a silent circle around the remains of the enemy. Pieces of metal beasts lay scattered across the ground, their once glowing red eyes now dark. But Ethan knew the truth. This wasn't over. Far beneath them, something else was waking up, and this battle had only been the beginning. The war beneath the planet. Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead and turned to the braided warrior. "We need to move. Now." She frowned but didn't argue. She turned to the queen, speaking in their deep, powerful language. The queen listened carefully. Then she nodded. Ethan let out a breath of relief. He didn't need a translator to know what she had decided. They were going underground. He reached for the old data pad from the crashed Starfall ship and pulled up Commander Rayner's last known location. The logs suggested there had been another facility, a deeper one, buried beneath the planet's surface. Whatever was truly waking up, it was down there. And they had to stop it before it was too late. Descent into darkness. The warriors packed what they could carry, weapons, food, armor. Then they moved. The entrance was hidden deep in the jungle, a gaping hole in the earth where the ruins of the UEF facility had been swallowed over time. Massive stone pillars, now overgrown with vines, stood as the only sign that humans had ever been here. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. Ethan's breath turned visible. The heat from the jungle vanished, replaced by something ancient, something unnatural. Then they reached it. A massive rusted door, half buried in rock and dirt. The words UEF Research Facility, Level X, were barely visible beneath the grime. Ethan took a step forward and pressed a hand against the metal. It was freezing. He turned to the braided warrior. "You ready?" She didn't answer. She just drew her weapon. Ethan smirked. That was answer enough. Then, with a deep breath, he gripped the handle and pulled. The door groaned. Then it opened. The facility of nightmares. The smell hit them first, but she understood the weight in his voice. She nodded. It was time for the final battle. The truth beneath the planet. As dawn broke over the jungle, Ethan and the warriors moved quickly, gathering what little they had left. Their numbers had dwindled, their weapons nearly useless against the mechanical beasts. But they had one advantage now: knowledge. The facility's final logs had revealed the truth. The machines weren't just waking up. They were protecting something. Something far older than the Amazons. Something buried beneath this world for centuries. Something that could wipe out every living thing if it ever emerged. Ethan checked his rifle. Only one shot left. He clenched his jaw. One shot wouldn't be enough. They had to find another way. The descent into the core. The entrance to the true underground chamber was hidden in a deep ravine, covered in layers of vines and thick roots. The warriors cut through the jungle, revealing an ancient metal hatch, massive in size, reinforced with old human tech. Ethan stared at it. It wasn't just an entrance. It was a containment door. The UEF had built this place, not to explore, but to lock something away. The braided warrior stepped beside him, her hands tightening around her weapon. Ethan took a deep breath. No turning back now. He placed his hand on the control panel. The moment he did, the ground shook violently. Then, the door groaned open. A wave of icy air rushed out, thick with the stench of something old, metallic, and rotting. Then, from the shadows, a massive shape began to emerge. The final enemy. The last Titan. At first, Ethan couldn't comprehend its size. The creature was colossal, a fusion of metal and flesh, its body pulsing with unnatural energy. Thick cables and rusted armor covered its massive frame, and its face, if it even had one, was a twisted fusion of bone and steel, with burning red eyes that seemed to pierce straight into his soul. This was what the UEF had been afraid of. This was what had wiped them out. The Amazons roared, preparing for battle. But Ethan knew the truth. They couldn't fight this thing. Not with their weapons. Not with brute force. This wasn't a war to be won with strength. This was a war to be won with sacrifice. The hero's gamble. Ethan turned to the braided warrior. He placed a hand on her shoulder and met her eyes. Then he did something unexpected. He handed her the rifle. Her brows furrowed in confusion. He pulled a thermal detonator from his belt and pointed at the massive creature. Then he gestured toward the facility ruins. She understood immediately. Her eyes widened in shock. She shook her head. No. But Ethan gave a small, knowing smile. Someone had to do it. Someone had to stop this thing from ever escaping. She clenched her jaw, but after a long moment, she finally nodded. Ethan turned back to the monster. It was still rising, its body stretching into the cavern's ceiling, tearing through metal and stone like it was nothing. No time left. He took a deep breath, gripping the detonator tightly. Then he ran. A race against time. The beast let out a horrific metallic screech, sending shockwaves through the cavern. Ethan dodged falling debris, sprinting toward the heart of the facility. The heat was unbearable, the air vibrating with unnatural energy. He reached the main power core, the last functioning remnant of the UEF's failed containment system. This was it. The only thing keeping this creature from fully escaping was the ancient reactor buried deep beneath the planet. If he could overload it, the entire world might collapse in on itself. But that was a risk he had to take. Ethan slammed the detonator against the console and activated it. The timer started counting down. 10 seconds. The final goodbye. Through the smoke, he saw her. The braided warrior. She had followed him. She stood at the entrance, staring at him, her face torn between respect and sorrow. Ethan gave her a small, tired smile. Go. She didn't move. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she gave him a warrior's salute. A slow nod. Then, she turned and ran. Ethan exhaled. 5 seconds. He turned back to the core. The beast screeched, realizing too late what was happening. It lunged forward. Too late. Ethan closed his eyes. Boom. The legend is born. The jungle erupted in light. The explosion ripped through the planet, sending a shockwave so powerful it cracked the skies. The Amazons barely made it out in time. They reached higher ground, watching as the cavern collapsed inward, swallowing the last remnants of the metal beasts forever. The braided warrior stood at the edge of the cliff, her hands clenched into fists. She stared at the ruins. Ethan was gone. A warrior remembered. Days passed. The village rebuilt. But something had changed. Ethan's name became a legend. The Amazons told stories of the warrior who came from the stars, the man who had saved their world with his own life. The braided warrior, now a leader among her people, carved his name into stone, so no one would ever forget. But as she stood at the highest peak, staring at the stars, she felt something deep in her bones. Ethan wasn't just a warrior. He was a reminder that humanity wasn't just about survival. It was about sacrifice.